Hello and welcome to this special edition of the Author Talk webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Arts in Science Writing Program, the Johns Hopkins University AAP DEI Committee, and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Tonight's event features a discussion with authors Olivia Campbell and Dava Sobel. My name is Peter Huggins and I'm the event producer. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the AAP Author Talk playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function or the chat, and we'll answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of tonight's event. With that, I will turn over the presentation to Melissa Hendricks-Joyce, Program Director and Senior Lecturer for the Master of Arts in Science Writing Program.
Thanks so much, Peter, and welcome everybody to this Author Talk, which happens to be taking place during Women's History Month. And so it's no coincidence that we are featuring two women authors writing about the history of women in science, and I'm delighted that they are joining us. First, I'd like to give a loud shout out to the hosts for this evening's talk, the Johns Hopkins AAP DEI Committee and the MA in Science Writing Program, which have together organized and are sponsoring this event. And I just want to put a plug in for the DEI Committee. It's doing great work. If you happen to be a faculty member or a staff member here at Johns Hopkins and you'd like to get involved, just feel free to email me and I will give you some more information about it. And now I'm delighted to introduce our moderator for the evening, Trisha Muro. Trish is someone who dreamed of becoming an astronaut. She didn't. Instead of exploring the vacuum of space, she's filling one instead by writing a book that explains core physics concepts through the lens of spaceflight missions. Her collection of essays will be published this fall?
Next spring.
Next spring, okay, yep. With Johns Hopkins Press. Trisha also freelances for publications such as Science News Explores and Open Mind Magazine and for various astronomy organizations. And finally, I would be remiss not to mention that Trisha has 3 degrees from Johns Hopkins, a bachelor's in physics, a master's in teaching, and best of all, a master's in science writing.
Indeed, Hopkins can't get rid of me. Thank you.
We're so pleased to have you, Trisha, as our moderator. Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa. Welcome everybody to this evening of discussing the history of women in physics, which is such a special and dear topic to my heart. I'd like to give each author, first of all, a very heartfelt welcome. Thank you so much, Dava. Thank you, Olivia. And if I could ask you to just summarize your books. Let's start with Olivia, Sisters in Science. How do you like to summarize? Exactly. How do you like to summarize your book to people who haven't yet had the pleasure of reading it?
My book is about 4 women physicists who were among the first of their generation to achieve physics degrees, to be allowed to attend university in Germany, just as they were getting settled in their careers. And, you know, things were going really well. They were professors, they were doing research on the cutting edge. Hitler comes in and stomps all over that progress. So we have these 4 women who are fleeing, not only for jobs, but for 2 of them who were Jewish, also for their lives. So it's barely make it out, some of them, and you know, come to new careers in the US, and then for one of them in Sweden. So they kind of reestablish themselves and go on to inspire the next generation of women physicists in the US and abroad.
Perfect. Same question to you, Dava, with your book, The Elements of Marie Curie. There we go. How do you like to summarize your book?
So my book is about the most famous woman in the history of science, but it shows that she was certainly never the only one, nor did she want to be. And it tells the story of the 45 women who passed through her laboratory, either working for her or as her students. And also the makes mention of the 150 women, French women she trained during the First World War to be X-ray technicians. So it's an element of her story that hasn't been told before.
And that is the perfect segue to my first question for each of you, which is, when you started your projects, were you starting with the exact idea? How much of this did you know along the way? How much was a surprise that you discovered?
Do you want to go first, Olivia?
Sure. I found this idea. I read an article in Smithsonian Magazine about just academics generally during the Nazi era and their attempts to escape. That pointed me to a project at Northeastern University of data gathering on women specifically. There were 80 women academics who were trying to escape the Nazis. So this project sort of collected as much data as possible on these women with the goal of finding out if they had been successful in achieving grants to help them escape, and whether if they didn't get grants, whether they were able to escape or not. Very few women were awarded these grants. Most of them went to men. So I was kind of just poking around, looking for a story. My initial idea was, okay, maybe there's a story of a woman who did survive and escaped, and maybe juxtaposition that with the story of a woman who didn't survive, who was not able to escape. But what I found was these three physicists who all specialized in spectroscopy, and then Lise Meitner, who was also part of this group, who all these four women knew each other, and to have Lise Meitner be in that group of them as a much more well-known of these other women. So that was just great. That was a story I really wanted to tell. They all knew each other, either went to school together at one point or worked together, and then they helped each other escape when time came, and then they all worked together in America together as well. So that it was just really fascinating to pull that apart, pick at those threads. And I did find a lot of women who didn't survive, and there is a whole chapter dedicated to them as well, because I felt like I couldn't leave that out. Right, there's it was a huge absence as part of the book, that these people, I couldn't tell their stories because their stories stopped.
Indeed. Dava, what about you?
So I am embarrassingly late to the issue of women in science. It really dawned on me in the course of writing my previous book, The Glass Universe, just how difficult things really were for women, and feelings that I had that I hadn't been aware of, because throughout the research for that project, and I'm embarrassed to say it, but I kept being surprised by what they had managed to do. So it was a reckoning with my own negative attitudes about women, and then realizing how many women had the same sort of undiagnosed latent misogyny. I mean, I really don't know what else to call it. So that really was an awakening for me. And now all I want to do is tell women's stories. And my editor at Grove, George Gibson, suggested a new biography of Madame Curie. And I really didn't want to do that because she's already so famous. There's so many books about her, and I didn't think I had anything new to say. But then I was asked to review a book called Women in Their Element, which was a collection of about 35 essays about women chemists. And of course, Madame Curie was one of the profiles, and her daughter Irene was another. But then there were all these others who mentioned some formative period in her laboratory, so that it started to sound like a network. And that was really interesting. And that I knew I had never read that about her. So that was the idea for the story. And then the problem with it is that some of those women really left hardly a trace, maybe one scientific paper. But there were enough of them whose lives could be filled out and who were all carried along by the story of her life. Adventure,
That's beautiful.
love, loss, and radioactivity.
And that brings us to the idea of allies working together, networks. And I have to commend your subtitle, which for those of you who don't have your book in front of you, the subtitle is How the Glow of Radium Lit a Path for Women in Science. And as you're saying, I mean, that was a real light bulb moment for me too, because of course we've all heard of Marie Curie, but we have not heard of all these other women. And so I'm wondering, at what point in both of your research did this theme of allyship really start to emerge as, oh, this is the story I need to tell?
Well, I'll just say for me, that was the story from
That was it. Yeah. What about you, Olivia?
I feel like there's so many of these women who, when you read about what men would say about them at the time, it was like, oh, well, you're the exception, right? You're the special, you're just like, okay, we'll let you in because obviously there's something about you. It happened to Lise Meitner, you know, one of the professors she came to in Germany had been very much against women in science, and he's like, oh, well, obviously you've already got your PhD from Vienna, you can come, you know, you're fine. So it's this idea that these women, upon hearing these things, go, okay, wait a minute, no, we're not. I'm going to start encouraging other women because I'm not exceptional. Everyone, when given the opportunity to study science, if they want to, can be as good as me or better, right? So that taking that sort of lack of allyship and turning it into a sisterhood, turning it into, okay, I'm going to help other women see and get them the opportunities they need to get the education and to make the steps they can make to get these degrees and show that, of course, there's no difference than men. They can get a degree in physics just the same as everyone else.
Yeah, it was really beautiful to read in both of your books how each of these women was helped by a number of people, and each of them went on to help even more, kind of continuing that pay it forward kind of a mentality. Unfortunately, the flip side is the backstabbers. Each of them encountered a number of backstabbers, both men and women, throughout their experiences. And I'm wondering how, as you were researching, how did you balance the 2020 of hindsight with, you know, researching and learning their points of view as they were living these moments?
I'm trying to think of a woman who could be called a backstabber in the case of Madame Curie. And I'm not coming up with one. Certainly she took she received unpleasant comments from men, but usually behind her back, because she was a world expert in her field and was acknowledged as such during her lifetime, so that she was frequently in meetings with Max Planck, Albert Einstein, Ernest Rutherford. She knew all the top physicists in the world. But in terms of people helping her, certainly it was not just women. She had a tremendous network of support from men, beginning with her father and an older brother, who both felt she deserved an advanced education, even though in Warsaw, where she grew up, women were not allowed to attend university. So she hatched this plan to go to Paris, and then she met Pierre, who was even more supportive of her. And when they had children, his father came to live with them to take care of the children so she could continue working. it really made me think about all the men in my life who have been supportive and helpful. And then once Pierre died and she was in charge of the lab and had assumed his professorship, which made her the only woman in the world with that kind of control, people just flocked to her, women certainly, but also men. And the women came not just from France, but Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, Canada. And she had men from as far away as India and Japan. So her effect was global and tremendous. And these people would come and work in the lab for a few years, but then they go home. So some of the women in their turn became the first female professors in their home countries. Certainly the first to study and teach the new science of radioactivity.
Yeah, yeah. And Olivia, for you, I'm so struck by Lise Meitner's pleas to her former colleagues of saying, I need you to understand what you have done with regard to the backstabbers in her life. How did you navigate that road for her story?
So I was just thinking about how Lise had a little sort of a professional rivalry. It was sort of friendly, but with Irene Curie, Marie's daughter. So they were doing the same sort of research, and so they would kind of, compete to publish and then compare findings. And Lise is like, "Oh, they're wrong over there." So I was just thought that was an interesting crossover. But yeah, so Otto has been her partner since she arrived in Berlin in 1907, and here we're up to let's see, 1938, and she's getting forced out of the country by Hitler. Her case is personally taken up by the police, and she's going to be deported soon, probably, if she doesn't escape. Well, Otto feels very left behind and betrayed in his own way. He's sending her like these whiny letters. I was so mad at him the whole time. But yeah, the whole of her career, he's been this great supporter and always been, when she first started, there was people, the other guys at the institute would walk by and say hi to him and not say hi to her. It was very catty and very much that he was helping her feel like she belonged, and to have him then turn around when she really needs him most and be like, "Oh, you left me behind." And after the war is over, she's basically like shaking him in letter form. I feel like I really tried really hard to. I felt it was really important to me to get large chunks of her letter to him after the war, just basically saying, how can you not understand how huge of a deal this was for Jewish people? How can you not have any empathy or sympathy? He's just so concerned with his own little problems, and she is so mad at him. They remain friends. It's close, but yeah, to see her one closest companion kind of turn on her and see that relationship sour. And also, it didn't help the fact that the research that she had started 4 years before she had to leave finally culminates. She is in Sweden at this point, and she discovers what is happening in the research, which is nuclear fission. So she realizes this, she publishes her paper separately of him, and of course he gets the credit, he gets the Nobel. She's not mentioned anywhere, ostensibly for her own safety at first, but then he just kind of likes taking the glory for it, right? And so he actually has to go to Sweden where she's living to accept the Nobel after the war, and it's not a great reunion. So yes, that was a really fascinating relationship to depict.
And that leads to another question about conducting all of this research. When you're looking back at primary sources written in other languages, how do you navigate that? Do you speak the languages? Did you hire a translator? What were some of your techniques for diving both historically and linguistically?
Well, fortunately, Madame Curie wrote all her almost all her papers in French.
Mm-hmm.
And I can fluently read Italian, and French is virtually identical in grammar. So I just needed a good dictionary and a lot of patience. I didn't have to talk to anybody. It was the pandemic.
Yeah.
And the other fortunate thing was how much of her work, her lab notebooks, her letters, even the handwritten grief journal that she kept for the year following her husband's death, all of that was accessible online, which I found astounding. And then she carried on a lifelong correspondence with her daughters. And those letters have been published, also in French. But the beauty of their relationship, the closeness that they had, even though the younger daughter was not a scientist and was pretty much left out of family discussions, so she was a musician and a writer, but they all loved each other and were writing letters constantly.
So at least you had plenty of records to search through.
Plenty of material, yeah.
Yeah.
That's so important to have, to be able to have the person speak in her own voice.
Yeah. Olivia, what about you? What was your research process like?
I definitely hired a translator. I do not speak German, and I don't really know a whole lot about physics, at least before this started. I feel like I've learned some. I may have learned more German than I did physics, but yeah. So I had the same sort of experience where after the pandemic, a lot of things are online now, or you can contact an archive and be like, can I get this? Can you scan this for me? And they're like, oh, sure. So it's a lot easier now. I did go in person to the University of Chicago, massive archive of James Franck stuff, and it had stuff of every single woman. It had Bertha Sponer's stuff, who married Franck in his later years. It had stuff about Hildegard Stücklen, and it had lots and lots of Lee's letters. Lise Meitner was, friends with Franck for their whole lives also. So that was a lot of fun. I always like to be able to touch something that the women have written, the women I'm writing about. I like to have a sort of tactile experience with them, and knowing that they have touched this document at some point, and that I'm touching it. I feel it really connects me to them in spirit. So that's sort of something I have to do.
So that makes me wonder about modern times. I wonder what advice you think these women might offer us in our day and age for how to tell the stories of the women in science who don't, splash across the headlines with every discovery. What advice either do you have, or do you think these women would have as far as highlighting the contributions of women across the sciences?
I think they published their own papers, and that they would consider that the most important thing they could do, or writing books. Madame Curie wrote a 2-volume treatise on radioactivity early in her career, and then was rewriting it, bringing it up to date when she died. But she also wrote a book about her experiences during the war, radiology in the war. And that's how they created an indelible, lasting record. I thought you were going to ask what will happen for future writers when they're
That's another thing I'm thinking right now. Yeah.
who exchange emails and texts. All I can say is I don't regret the fact that I won't live to have that problem.
That's a reasonable response. Yeah. Olivia, what do you think?
So Lise Meitner's estate is very well taken care of. She has relatives that hold the rights to things. I was in touch with them to clear those quotes and get rights to photos and things. So the other women don't really have anything in place, but I felt like Lise very much, at multiple points, was very clear about how she wanted to be portrayed, whether or not she wanted to be portrayed. She was approached for her likeness to be used in a movie during her lifetime. She was quite famous, during her lifetime, and I don't think we realize that. She was, comes to America, gets to the airport, and there's cameras flashing, there's news reporters, she's invited to every university, and there's state dinners with the president in her honor. She was a huge deal. So this movie was going to use her likeness, and she said, absolutely not, you're not going to do that. So when Oppenheimer came out recently, there was a lot of talk and response like, oh, Christopher Nolan doesn't like to include women in his movies. He didn't include very many women scientists, and there were a lot more involved in this project than he's depicting. And would Lise Meitner, should she have been in the film? I argue that she would not have wanted to be in the film. Yes, maybe she should have been mentioned in connection with the discovery of fission, but she wanted nothing to do with the creation of a bomb. That was very much against her ethos. She was in the front lines as a nurse in World War I. She never wanted to be party to creating any kind of pain and suffering like that she saw. And it was a big deal for her to refuse this too. So I think the fact that she has people, helping to shape how she's seen now, and that she was so vocal about how she was perceived and how her likeness was used. There were so many wild news stories coming out after the bomb was created about how, this female, this Jewess escapes to Sweden with a bomb in her purse. This like really outlandish, headlines that are totally fabrications. And she gets on the radio and she talks to people. She tries to control the narrative. She tries to make it better. I don't know that she made it any better. I think she felt like she made it worse by trying to address it. But it was very interesting to see how she, as a public figure, address these things during her lifetime. And I really hope that she felt like I did her justice in the book. That's my main goal with all the books I write about women, is that I would like my subjects to feel like I've done them justice. Not that I've painted them in a soapy way, in a sort of like, too good to be true kind of way, but that I have depicted them realistically and their whole selves.
We have one question that's come in from the audience from Rachel Weber Holm. She said, is there anything that didn't make it into your books that you think was particularly interesting or that was painful to have to cut? And I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about the decision to shape the narrative once you got underway.
It would be counterproductive to leave out the good parts. I really didn't feel there was anything I had to leave out, but any writer shapes the story by telling it. You intentionally or otherwise see a narrative arc that is your version of the story. This is why history is so interesting, and why the accounts are so different, and they get more different all the time. Enough said about that.
So your cutting room floor was pretty.
Yeah, I only had one thing that I cut, and it was at the strong suggestion of one of the technical expert readers. I always ask as many subject matter experts as I can if they'd be willing to read the manuscript and for accuracy. And so I had an idea about Paul Langevin, who was the physicist, very famous physicist in France, who had been a good friend of both Marie and Pierre Curie. And about 5 years after Pierre's death, Marie had an affair with him, which became public, and she was vilified in the press. It was a big scandal. But I think at first, because he spoke to her about his unhappy marriage, that she really thought that he was leaving the marriage and that she would have a second chance at the kind of marriage she'd had with Pierre, where the two of them would not only be lovers, but would share this interest in physics that they could talk about. So Langevin is famous for the twin paradox. When Einstein's theories came out, he was the one who had the idea of the identical twins, and one of them goes into space and travels near the speed of light, so he doesn't age, and then he comes back to Earth and can barely recognize his brother, who's now a very old man.
Yeah.
So it was irresistible to think of Marie imagining Pierre as a pair of twins. Paul Langevin as a pair of twins. And one of them could do the dutiful thing and stay in the unhappy marriage, but the other one could find perfect love with her.
Yeah.
My historian of scientist said, cut that.
No.
So I did.
What about you, Olivia?
Oh, that sounds fun. I like that. My editor asked me to cut back on, I had woven too much of one of the women who did not survive, that was murdered by the Nazis. I had too much of her woven throughout there. Like, it's kind of taking away from your four main women. It's already, four is already a lot. My first book was only 3. Four is pushing it for, keeping the characters apart and understanding the flow and having enough space to give each woman their due, right? So there was this woman who had caught my attention at the beginning, Leonore Breischer, who was a butterfly scientist who was murdered by the Nazis. I couldn't get over this narrative of this woman doing the most beautiful work with the most beautiful creatures in the world, and of course she's horribly murdered. And so I kept trying to, and I had a lot of information on her, so it was really hard for me to leave that out. So I did my best, but then I went and wrote an essay about her after the book came out. So I needed to get her out of my system. I needed to give her the due that she deserved also, because it was just, I couldn't get the butterfly lady out of my head. She was, it was so tragic.
I love that. When I was in the various Hopkins writing classes, one of my classmates gave me the advice of, when you do have to cut something that you love out of your work, go ahead and cut it out of the current work, but save it for something later. And so I love that you were able to apply that on a scale as large as a book and subsequent essay. That's beautiful. So as a woman who started in physics myself, I'm dying to know how you each walked the tightrope of how much physics to explain as part of the narrative. Because obviously, we can say, radioactivity and fission and stuff, and, the public has a very general idea of what that means. But you each did a lovely job of really diving into, okay, what does this mean? What is actually happening in these processes? And so I'd love to hear more about how you walked that tightrope of how much do I explain, how much do I leave for the for the reader to go and Google on their own. How did you navigate that?
Yeah, I don't think I should make the reader go off and do research to understand the book. I had to understand these things myself, and it was important to me to understand the science the way it was understood at the time, and not the way it's understood now, and to let it unfold. That was part of the story. In fact, the editor and I considered the periodic table as a character in the story, because it grew and changed with the understanding of radioactivity. And several elements got discovered in the course of the story, including one by Lisa Meitner. So it was very important to have the science there. What were they doing in the lab? I always want to know that. And years ago, I had a column at Discover that actually allowed me to to ask scientists if I could follow them around for a couple of days and then just write about what it was they were doing when they were doing research.
wow.
Because for most people, that is a mystery.
Yeah.
It's just a big black box doing research. So
Yeah.
the more you can say about what is the moment to moment, how do they make these measurements, what are the instruments they're using, I think it's really important.
What about you, Olivia?
I tried to use a lot of metaphor, analogy. I tried to do the same thing where I would describe the instruments they were using. I would describe what they would be physically doing with those instruments. I used what I think my favorite thing was, it was from an article. Can't remember where it was from, but there was a physicist who wrote about the discovery of fission, and I couldn't think of a better way to describe it than how he described it, which was shooting raisins at a cake.
Mm.
And like the idea that you wouldn't expect the cake to break in half exactly, you know, but you would expect it to sort of chip pieces off of the cake, right? So that's those sort of visualizations. I tried as much as possible to use imagery like that to sort of, oh, okay, I see what they're saying. And the same is true, that they couldn't figure out what was happening because what was happening in their research didn't fit with the way they understood physics to work, the way they understood the natural world to work at that time. So I had to sort of spell out what it was, what the main principles of how physics was understood at the time, classical physics. So their discovery was kind of blowing this out of the water, everything that they knew. So that's why they couldn't figure it out. It wasn't that they were stupid, it was that they were exploding classical physics as we knew it, and they were about to figure out something that would change how we viewed how physics works, how the world works.
I love that you both emphasize the importance of being in the time, not only being in the character, in the person, in the place, but in the time, and doing your best to reflect what was known at that time. That's so crucial and so difficult to do, because, you know, of course, we all know what the periodic table looks like now, and it's got to be so difficult to, you know, detach your own brain from, okay, I can't think about that part right now. What was known then was, you know, so much simpler, so much smaller. That's really fascinating. We have a question from one of the viewers, Sasha Cheek, who said, how difficult was it for you to reach out and secure interviews with subject matter experts in subjects like particle physics? And were there any specific challenges that you faced with trying to connect with people in these highly, you know, expertise-driven fields?
I didn't conduct a lot of interviews. It was hard to find people who were really knowledgeable about physics 100 years ago. People were only too happy to talk about their current research and current understanding. But I had to figure most of that out myself. And the way I did it was by reading their papers. It becomes instantly clear what they know and what they don't know. And then for finding people to read a finished manuscript is a little easier. Of course, you never know how carefully they're actually reading it, and how much can you expect someone who's already busy to do, which is why it's good to ask a lot of people and hope that at least some of them will be reading and will catch the real howlers.
Yeah. What about you, Olivia?
I didn't hire a subject matter expert. I kind of wish I did, but I think it turned out okay. I don't know, you guys, you're a physicist, so if there's anything glaring, do let me know. But I was trying to see if I could interview anyone who had been a student of these women in America, and everyone had passed away. I have this list of names, and then I would do a search for, I'm like 10 people to try to contact, and they were had all passed away. So I was able to speak with one woman who had met one of them and was kind of the keeper of her biography. She like took her files from the university after she passed away and was like keeping all her photos and things. So she was kind of became a repository of this woman's life. So I spoke with her, and then I hired a Jewish sensitivity reader. That's who I did have do a final read. I am not Jewish, and I wanted to make sure those points were done well, and that it was acceptable from a Jewish perspective how I was presenting these people.
Mm-hmm. We have a couple questions coming in that are very similar, and they're essentially asking, how has this writing process and the storytelling, as you highlighted these women, how has it affected you in your own life? And we've kind of touched on that, but there are enough people asking. I feel like we should go ahead and give a spotlight to that very important question of, the writer shapes the work, as you were saying, Dava, earlier, but the work shapes the writer too. And I agree. I'd love to hear more about that for each of you.
Well, certainly my sense of women scientists has been greatly informed by my work of the past few years, and I look forward to having it far further informed. But getting to be alone in a room with Madame Curie throughout the pandemic was really a fantastic experience. And I was constantly surprised by how many people would tell me when they learned what I was writing about, oh, she's my hero. And these were not just women scientists, but men, very young women who would say they went into science because of her. And I was wondering, how could you pick someone like Madame Curie as your role model? Someone who's made giant discoveries and won 2 Nobel Prizes. It's a role model who's daunting, really, and inspirational. But it never works that way. Even now, she still functions as a role model for young women. And I think the answer is her personality, because she's so straightforward. She's so simple in her way of life. She never cared about money. She wasn't interested in being famous. In fact, she found it a liability, because when she won her first Nobel Prize, the world invaded the laboratory and she couldn't get anything done. But for me, it was her attitude. I mean, we had the pandemic to deal with, but it, compared to things that she faced in her life, it was relatively minor. And her way of dealing with difficult situations was never to complain, but to figure out a way around whatever was blocking her path, and then just doing it. And I think I'm going to try to emulate that as much as I can from here on.
My agent always tells me when I choose a book topic that you have to find something that you're not going to get sick of for the next 4 years, because it's going to take that long. A good narrative nonfiction is going to be, it's a solid 4 years of research. So I like to think that these women kind of live inside my head for 4 years. I'm like speaking with them for however long. And it's definitely a privilege to get to put their lives onto the page. But I feel like seeing all that they went through with this book, seeing these women go through this horrible experience of being pulled away from their careers. Lisa Meitner especially, she's the head of a department. She's the first physics professor in Germany. She's a full professor. She got tenure. She loses tenure when she gets exiled. She's got her lab set up exactly how she wants it. She's got her friends, her colleagues, these amazing research collectives that have been building over decades that really they were totally crushed by the Nazis, and who knows what advances we lost to that. But after going through these experiences, they survived. There's an element of survivor's guilt going on because, a lot of them lost friends and family members. But to then go to a new country, learn a new language, suddenly start teaching, learn a new job, learn a new way of, teaching. There's a very different atmosphere in US universities than there was in German universities. So this was like a huge learning curve. But that they then were like dropped into these situations and still thrived. They still had this amazing personalities and outlook. We have Herta Sponer, who sort of took the two other women who were in the US under her wing and said, come to my lab at Duke every summer and do the research that you can't do during the year at these small women's colleges you're at. And she was all about publishing, right? She was prolific. She was publishing papers constantly, and she really was encouraging the other women to do the same. She's like, this is how you make your name. This is how you make your mark, and prove to the Americans that you are worthy of being here. But yeah, so it's just, there was a moment during the writing of this book where I had to take a break from it because it was a lot. Like I will never be able to write about the Holocaust period or anything to do with the Nazis again, because it was emotionally devastating for me. So that's another thing that I need to think about in my next book is that, think whether it's going to be, too much. It was the chapter about the women who were murdered by the Nazis. Every time I read it, I cried. So
Yeah.
It may not be edited as well as the other chapters because I would avoid it. Every edit read through, I was like, no, I'm skipping that chapter. I can't read that chapter. So that's another aspect. So just seeing how resilient they were and how they went on to inspire, other women and men in science in America was just, it was incredible.
That's really beautiful. We have a couple more questions coming in from viewers, but I also wanted, in the spirit of lifelong learning, I'd love to give you two, the opportunity to ask each other any questions that you have about one another's books.
Well, as I read your book, Olivia, I had a double chill as the Nazis took over and rights were gradually taken away from women. And I'm wondering if you see any parallels in the current situation.
I absolutely do. So as I was going through my final past pages over last summer, I was reading about the quotes from Goebbels and Hitler about a woman's place. And at the same time, I was hearing from Trump and Vance about where they thought women's place was. And the parallels were terrifying. So much so that I wrote an essay about it. That's how I process my feelings, apparently. So I pitched this essay all over newspapers. Like nobody wants this piece of the newspapers. It went on so long that I retooled it. It had initially been about, okay, what is Trump going to do once he gets in office to women's rights? So I had been pitching it for so long that they were in office by this point. They were starting to strip rights. So I retooled the essay, including the beginnings of what they're, crushing DEI and other elements. So finally, Vanity Fair took it. I just published in Vanity Fair. I've been getting vile hate mail from Trump supporters in response. I've gotten 2 super right-wing news organizations writing response articles saying that I'm deranged for saying that Trump misogyny is akin to Nazi misogyny, but I stand by my position, and I'm glad
that was
to have gotten
brave.
it published. I hope it makes a difference. I mean, obviously I've poked a bear and I've pointed out something true because they're reacting the way they are. But yes, it's been an experience.
Yeah, no, that was very brave. I'll look for your piece.
Thank you.
Good for you for doing it.
We have a couple of requests in the comments to include a link. So I'll make sure that, or I'll ask Melissa that we can include the link in the recording or in a follow-up email.
Yeah.
So I just recommended
in my room. I should turn on a light.
I just recommended The Glass Universe in, I had a Wall Street Journal column on the 5 best books on women in science. I don't know if you saw it, but I recommended The Glass
thank
Universe
you.
as one of them because it's amazing. I was very excited that I get to talk to you and that we got to be put together for this. I have so many questions. I'm wondering how you were talking about, you know, the 150 year, you're including hundreds of women in these books. How do you keep the characters distinct? How do you ensure that everyone understands who's who? But more than that, how do you make it relevant? How do you continue to make these stories fresh for a new audience?
Well, one great advantage I had with The Glass Universe is that the discoveries those women made are still relevant.
Yes, they are.
Still important. And this year is the 100th anniversary of Cecilia Payne's publishing her finding that the stars consist mostly of hydrogen, which at the time everyone thought was a crazy idea. But it took only 4 years for the rest of the world to go along with her. And it's also 100 years since Edwin Hubble noticed that the universe was much bigger than the Milky Way, a discovery he made based on the work of another one of the Harvard women, Henrietta Leavitt. So that was a big help. And to keep the characters separate, I tried to build in a reminder. This is a technique that the Greek myths use. But in an oral tradition, there would be epithets about the characters so that you could remember who was who. And I also put a who's who as an appendix to the book, so each of the women had a paragraph at the back as a refresher. But keeping that in the story, I think having the story unfold carries the people along and makes it easier to remember who they are. Yeah, I hope that's clear. Maybe we could talk about that at greater.
Yeah, we could spend another hour on that. We have time for just one more, and it's very similar to what we just started talking about. So a little bit of this will be slightly repetitive, but I think this deserves a minute. This is from Emma Deans, and she says, "What advice do you have for science writers to make historical narrative relevant and timely in our stories? Should we emphasize natural history, bring up significant moments in the history of science, and/or simply bring to light hidden stories?" So again, we're kind of springboarding off of what you were just saying, Dava.
Well, I would just add that although I find I am interested in just about any story now about women in science, you can't sell just any story. I got very interested in another woman astronomer as a result of writing The Glass Universe, and I spent about a year on her and her family and writing a proposal. But she never made the kinds of discoveries that carry to the present day. And so no publisher I approached was interested in her story. So I think that is a reality of the situation, that there has to be some kind of through line to the present. And in addition to the person having a compelling personality or story.
Yeah.
There's a big push, I feel like, into publishing today to have the word untold or, you know, similar in titles and things, I really shy away from this, because obviously if I'm telling the story, it's because I've been in the archives. If the people are in the archives, it's not untold. Someone archived that piece of paper, they know it's there. That's not
Right.
new information, you know, like I don't like this concept of, oh, I'm discovering this, because we're not discovering this. It's very rare that a nonfiction history writer is going to be discovering something in an archive. So that's my first bugbear. My second bugbear is that use of the word girls in titles about books about women. I will not have the word girls in the title if it's about women. If there are actual girls in the story, sure, great. But I digress. So I feel like, I'm sorry, I just need a drink of water.
Sure. Take your time.
Sorry, I just got something in the back of my throat there. So with publishers, you really have to sell the relevance. You have to sell the impact. They want to know, they would like for you to be unearthing something, to be some new information, right? But also that new thing, that finding that person had, has to be still impacting us today. It has to be big enough that they can show you why this person is important. So it was a little bit of a hard sell with Sisters in Science, because Lise Meitner is the only one in this group that really had something that you could really spell out, that she discovered nuclear fission. Like, that's a huge, you know, thing that changed the how we understand the universe. So
Yeah.
for the other women, it was just a matter of they were publishing regularly in their fields. They got a patent. They got, you know, they were doing well as academics, as professors. They were breaking barriers, but they weren't necessarily huge, you know, making huge discoveries within their field, right? Yes, they were there at a time when like quantum physics is being birthed, and they're part of those conversations. Maybe some research they did was then built upon by other people and became something very important, right? But those kinds of threads are hard for people to connect the dots there a lot of times. So it's really a matter of finding those stories where you could easily say, this person did this and it's still affecting us today. So that's something that publishers are really looking for. They want that, this is why this person is important. This is why they deserve to be told, you know, to help their story told.
Hello, I'm popping back in because we are at the top of the hour. Unfortunately, I know this conversation could go on for a long time. Some folks asked about Olivia's Vanity Fair piece, and I posted a link to that in the chat area.
Thank you.
You should find that there. Thank you for writing that, Olivia. This hour has been so informative and inspiring. And I just have to say, we've talked about how the women featured in your books, Dava and Olivia, are inspiring characters. But I have to say, and I think everyone would agree with me, that you too are inspiring authors to find these stories and to bring them to us. There's so many great lessons there about science and history, including of course, the fact that we must, telling stories of history is important. They're not to be neglected, and we can learn a lot from them, even in this day and age. Thank you so much for your work. Thank you, Trisha, for moderating a fantastic conversation, and thank you everybody for joining us and asking wonderful questions. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.